I walked in after 16 hours on the lines, my boots caked in frozen mud, and my hands shaking from the cold. Taylor sat on our couch with a look that didn't belong in a home I had bought for our future. She didn't offer a greeting or a warm meal. My fiancée told me her ex proposed, and she said yes. So I sent everything to his controlling mother. Then I canceled the wedding, returned the ring, and packed her stuff. 1 week later, she showed up at my door screaming. Her voice had been flat when she first confessed it. She called me a stable man, a safe harbor she settled for while her real heart was in Seattle. My brain buffered for 30 seconds as I clutched my lunch bag. The betrayal felt like a high-voltage line snapping in the dark. I didn't yell or throw things. I simply watched the woman I loved turn into a stranger before my eyes. She actually expected me to thank her for being so honest. I spent the next 48 hours moving with mechanical precision. I called the vineyard in Sisters and clawed back my deposits, while Taylor stayed at a hotel. My brother Colton sat at the kitchen table, helping me hunt for Harry's digital footprint. We found the mother, Deborah, a woman whose social media was a shrine to her perfect, obedient son. Every post she made was a leash tightened around Harry's neck. I realized then that Harry was a coward who feared his own mother. The dossier was a work of art, bound in a professional clear plastic cover. It contained every gushing text she sent me and the receipt for the ring she had just discarded. I drove to Harry's apartment and slipped the truth under his door like a silent summons. I knew Deborah was inside, waiting to celebrate her son's return. The silence of the hallway felt heavy with the coming storm. I walked away without looking back at the silver BMW parked in the lot. The fallout was a beautiful, jagged disaster. From the street, I heard the first muffled screams of a mother who had been lied to for months. Harry's neighbors reported a weeping man being dismantled by his own protector. By noon, Harry had called Taylor to end it all. He chose his mother's approval over Taylor's. Desperate heart, just like he did 4 years ago. It was a cycle of weakness that I had simply accelerated. Taylor was now truly alone in a very small town. Now she is standing on my porch, her face a mask of red blotches and ruined makeup. She is pounding on the wood and demanding I fix the life she broke. I watch her through the security camera, feeling nothing but the quiet hum of a restored circuit. She thinks I am her safety net. But that man died in the ice storm. I turn off the porch light and walk toward the kitchen to make coffee. The screaming outside finally starts to fade into the rain. I sat in the darkness for hours, listening to the drip of the eaves. The silence following her departure felt heavier than the storm. I sat at my kitchen table and opened the laptop with steady hands. My primary objective was simple. I had to ensure Taylor could never rewrite this history to my employers or our friends. The primary obstacle was the digital trail. She was already beginning to delete. I moved fast to archive her gushing posts about Harry before they vanished. Each click felt like a surgical strike against a ghost. My brother Colton walked in through the mudroom, carrying 2 heavy breakfast burritos. He saw the grim set of my jaw and didn't ask stupid questions. We spent the next hour mapping out Harry's professional connections in the local medical supply industry. The turn came when we found his recent LinkedIn update. Harry had been promoted, but the fine print revealed he was still under his mother's financial umbrella. He was a corporate man with a childhood leash. The pressure escalated when my phone buzzed with a text from Taylor's father. He didn't offer an apology for his daughter's betrayal. Instead, he reminded me that the vineyard deposit was non-refundable and suggested I pay the balance quietly. I deleted the message without replying. My anger was no longer a hot flame. It had cooled into a hard, sharp tool. I realized then that they all expected me to be the silent, blue-collar martyr. Colton pointed at a specific Facebook comment from Deborah Calloway. She had written a public prayer for her son to find a traditional woman who valued legacy. The subtext was clear. She hated Taylor for being too ambitious and too independent during their first run. I started printing the evidence of Taylor's recent soulmate claims alongside our active wedding contracts. I was building a bridge of fire between their two worlds. The printer hissed in the quiet room. I drove to the gym at 6 the next morning to face Harry. I didn't want a fight. I wanted to see the man who thought I was a temporary placeholder. Harry was on the bench press when I stepped into his line of sight. He dropped the bar onto the safety racks with a loud, metallic clang. His face went pale beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. He knew exactly who I was. The power shifted without a single word spoken. He scrambled to the locker room before his set was even finished. I followed him at a distance, making sure he felt the weight of my presence. The locker room smelled of old sweat and expensive cologne. Harry fumbled with his lock, his fingers trembling visibly. I stood by the door and checked my watch. I wasn't there to hurt him. I was there to remind him that ghosts don't stay buried. He left his expensive water bottle behind. I picked up the bottle and carried it to the front desk. The clerk looked at me with confusion as I handed it over. I told him the owner had left in a great hurry. On the way to my truck, I saw Taylor's car parked at the end of the street. She wasn't inside, but a white envelope sat tucked under my windshield wiper. I opened it and found a legal notice regarding the house. The battle was no longer personal. I stared at the legal notice while the truck engine idled. Taylor was claiming a stake in the house I bought with my own overtime pay. My objective was now clear. I had to dismantle her financial leverage before she could bleed me dry. The primary obstacle was her sister Kylie, who had a friend in a local law office. Pressure mounted as I realized they were trying to freeze my assets. They wanted me broke and desperate. I drove straight to the utility yard to meet my foreman, Gus. He was leaning against a transformer, checking the schedule for the next line repair. I told him about the legal threat and the harassment at the gym. Gus spat on the gravel and looked at me with weary eyes. He told me the company had received an anonymous tip about my conduct. The turn was sudden. Taylor was already attacking my livelihood behind my back. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I kept my voice low. I showed Gus the archived posts and the timeline of the betrayal. He nodded slowly, recognizing the pattern of a desperate woman. He promised to hold the line with corporate, but he warned me to stay clean. I had to avoid any direct contact with Harry or Taylor. One wrong move would cost me my badge. I was walking a wire without a harness. I spent the afternoon at the county clerk's office, pulling property records. I needed proof that every cent of the down payment came from my accounts. The paperwork was a mountain of cold, hard facts. I found the original deed and the bank statements from 2 years ago. Taylor's name was nowhere on the primary funding documents. She had only contributed to the utility bills. I was building a fortress of paper to protect my home. Later that evening, Colton met me at a local diner to share new intel. He had spent the day tracking Deborah's favorite local spots through social media. We found that she spent every Saturday morning at a specific upscale bakery. This was the perfect location for a quiet, untraceable delivery. I felt the power balance shift as we finalized the timing. We were no longer reacting to her moves. We were setting the final trap. Colton laughed as he scrolled through more of Deborah's public posts. She was currently bragging about Harry's upcoming engagement to a mystery woman. She had no idea the woman was the same girl she rejected years ago. The irony was a sharp blade in the dark. I realized that Harry's lies to his mother were my greatest weapon. He was building a house of cards on a foundation of deceit. The tension was finally breaking. I returned home to find my front lock had been tampered with. Scuff marks marred the brass plate around the keyhole. Someone had tried to get inside while I was at the diner. My blood ran cold as I checked the perimeter of the dark porch. I realized Taylor still had a spare key I hadn't accounted for. A shadow moved near the tree line at the edge of the property. I wasn't alone in the woods tonight. I gripped my heavy flashlight and stepped off the porch into the biting air. My objective was to secure the perimeter and stop the trespassing. The primary obstacle was the darkness of the heavy tree line. I moved toward the shadow near the old oak. My boots crunched on the frost as I scanned the brush. I saw a flash of white fabric behind a trunk. It was Kylie, clutching a set of stolen spare keys. She didn't run when the light hit her face. Instead, she sneered and held the keys up like a trophy. She claimed Taylor had a right to her belongings inside. I told her the police were already on their way. The turn came when she laughed and showed me her phone screen. She was recording our encounter and streaming it to her followers. She wanted me to look like the aggressor. My calm was her only defeat. I stepped back and lowered the flashlight to avoid the glare. I told her she was trespassing on private property, recorded by my cameras. Kylie's face twisted as she realized the stream wasn't gaining the traction she wanted. She threw the keys into the dirt and spat toward my boots. She warned me that Harry had friends with real power in this town. I stood my ground until she climbed back into her Subaru. The engine roared. I spent the rest of the night installing new deadbolts and high-resolution cameras. Every screw I turned felt like a promise to my future self. I had to stay one step ahead of their erratic desperation. The pressure of the upcoming Saturday delivery weighed on my mind. I checked the dossier one last time to ensure every date was perfect. The truth had to be undeniable and sharp. I would not let them win this. The morning sun finally broke through the gray clouds over the Cascade Peaks. I drove to the upscale bakery where Deborah spent her Saturday mornings. The smell of fresh bread and expensive coffee filled the air. I saw her sitting by the window in a designer coat. She looked exactly like her photos. Prim, judgmental, and entirely unsuspecting. My heart hammered against my ribs as I adjusted the folder. This was the moment of no return. I didn't approach her directly to avoid a public scene. Instead, I waited until she stood up to browse the pastry case. I walked past her table and slid the professional folder onto her chair. I kept my head down and walked out the door. Through the window, I watched her return and pick up the dossier. She opened the cover and went completely still. The color drained from her face as she read the first page. I drove away feeling a strange sense of hollow victory. I had successfully dropped the bomb into the heart of their camp. My phone vibrated in the cup holder with an unknown number. I pulled over to the side of the road and answered. It was Gus, his voice sounding unusually tight and strained. He told me the police were at the utility yard with a warrant. They were looking for something I allegedly hid at work. I gripped the steering wheel as Gus explained the situation. My objective was to face the police and clear my name immediately. The primary obstacle was the timing of the search warrant. They were tearing through my locker and my work truck at the yard. I drove back with a hollow feeling in my chest. If they found anything suspicious, my career was finished. I arrived to see blue lights flashing against the heavy utility poles. Gus met me at the gate with a grim expression. The officers were examining a small velvet box found hidden behind my truck's seat. My heart stopped when I saw the familiar sparkle of a diamond ring. The turn was immediate and terrifying. I had returned the original ring weeks ago, kept the receipt. Someone had planted a different ring to frame me for theft. Taylor was trying to send me to prison for revenge. I pulled the return receipt from my glove box and handed it to the lead officer. I explained that the ring in his hand was not mine. I showed him the security footage from my new porch cameras. The video clearly showed Kylie creeping near my truck at 3 a.m. She had reached through the window. I left, cracked for ventilation. The officer watched the screen with a focused stare. The power shifted back toward the truth. The police left the yard to question Kylie about the planted evidence. Gus patted my shoulder, but the tension in the air remained thick. I realized that Taylor and her sister were spiraling out of control. They were no longer just hurt, they were dangerous and desperate. I had to finish this before they burned my life down completely. My phone buzzed with a notification from a hidden app. Deborah was calling Harry's phone repeatedly. I drove home and sat in the dark, watching my monitors. I felt the weight of the war I had started with a folder. Every shadow in the yard looked like a new threat. I checked the camera feed again and saw a silver BMW. Harry was sitting in my driveway with the lights turned off. He wasn't moving or getting out of the car. He just sat there in the silence of the night. The BMW idled for 20 minutes before the driver's door finally opened. Harry stepped out, looking like a man who had lost everything. He walked toward my porch with the dossier clutched in his hand. His face was puffy, and his expensive shirt was wrinkled. I met him at the door before he could knock. He looked at me with a mixture of hatred and fear. He told me his mother had disowned him. Harry threw the folder at my feet and started to walk away. He said, Taylor was pregnant, and the child was likely mine. My blood turned to ice as the words hit the cold air. I stood frozen on the porch while he drove away into the fog. If he was telling the truth, the battle was far from over. I looked down at the ruined folder in the dirt. A new, terrifying complication had just arrived. The porch light cast long, skeletal shadows across the frost. I stood motionless as Harry's taillights vanished into the gray mist of the valley. My primary objective was to verify the pregnancy claim before it became a permanent shackle. The primary obstacle was my own fear of a life long linked to Taylor. I stepped off the porch and retrieved the damp folder from the dirt. Harry's words felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. I needed facts to survive this. I walked back inside and sat at the kitchen table. The silence of the house was deafening. I pulled up my medical records on the laptop with cold, steady fingers. 6 months ago, I had undergone a routine vasectomy procedure that made his claim biologically impossible. My breathing slowed as the realization hit me with the force of a falling tree. Taylor was lying to Harry to keep him from leaving her forever. The power shifted back into my hands. The pressure didn't ease, entirely despite my secret knowledge. If Harry believed the lie, he would remain in town and continue his harassment. I had to expose the deception without breaking my promise to stay clean. I called Colton and told him to meet me at the trailhead at dawn. We needed a plan to leak the medical truth to the right person. The stakes had moved from my house to my very bloodline. I couldn't afford a single error. The sun rose over the Cascades, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple. Colton arrived in his truck, looking as tired as I felt. He listened to my news and let out a sharp whistle of disbelief. We discussed how to funnel my medical status to Deborah without appearing desperate. She was the only one with enough leverage to force a paternity test. Harry was too weak to demand the truth on his own. I needed the mother's wrath. We decided to use a mutual friend who worked at the clinic. It was a risky move that could backfire if the paper trail was traced. I wrote a brief, anonymous note explaining the situation in detail. I included the date of my procedure and the doctor's name for verification. We were playing a dangerous game with privacy laws and professional ethics. One slip would land us both in legal trouble. I felt the wire tightening under my feet. By noon, the information had been delivered to Deborah's private email address. I spent the afternoon at the yard, working on a downed transformer to stay busy. The physical labor was a welcome distraction from the mental war. Gus watched me from the bucket truck with a curious expression. He knew something was brewing beneath my calm exterior. The wind picked up, howling through the high tension lines above us. A storm was finally rolling into the basin. The call came just as I was finishing my shift. It was an unknown number from a Seattle area code. I answered and heard the sharp, clipped voice of Deborah Calloway. She didn't offer a greeting or an introduction. She asked me if the information she received was accurate and true. I told her to check the official records if she had any doubts. Her silence on the other end was a terrifying omen. She was a woman seeking vengeance. She thanked me for my honesty and hung up the phone. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. I had successfully turned the dragon toward its own kin once again. The power balance was now entirely in Deborah's favor. She would tear Taylor's lie apart with surgical precision. I was finally an observer in my own tragedy. I drove home through the driving rain, feeling lighter than I had in months. The driveway was empty when I arrived back at the house. I checked the security feeds and saw that Taylor had visited again. She hadn't tried the door this time. She had simply left a single baby shoe on the porch swing. It was a manipulative prop designed to trigger my guilt and my wallet. I picked it up and tossed it into the trash can without hesitation. The psychological warfare was becoming pathetic and transparent. I was done playing. I sat in my living room and watched the rain hit the glass. My phone chimed with a news alert from the local paper. A silver BMW had been involved in a high-speed chase on Highway 97. The driver had lost control and flipped into the lava rocks near the turnoff. My heart hammered as I read the description of the vehicle. Harry was in the hospital, and Deborah was already on her way to the scene. The blue glow of the news report filled my darkened living room. My objective was to stay out of the chaos while the fallout settled. The primary obstacle was the proximity of the crash to my work site. I knew those lava rocks well from my time fixing lines. Harry had likely panicked under the weight of his mother's new knowledge. I felt a surge of cold pity that vanished almost instantly. He had helped Taylor try to destroy my reputation and my career. I poured a glass of water and watched the rain streak the glass. The turn came when the reporter mentioned a second passenger in the silver BMW. Taylor had been in the car during the high-speed flight toward the rocks. My stomach lurched at the thought of her being hurt on my account. The power shifted as I realized the pregnancy lie was about to face a hospital. A medical team would uncover the truth far better than any folder could. The game was ending. I grabbed my keys and drove towards St. Charles Hospital in the pouring rain. I needed to see the end of this narrative with my own eyes. The emergency room was a hive of activity and bright, sterile light. I saw Deborah standing near the triage desk, her expensive coat stained with mud. She looked older and more fragile than she had at the bakery. She turned and locked eyes with me across the lobby. Her gaze was sharp and full of jagged steel. She walked over to me, her heels clicking on the polished white tiles. She didn't scream or accuse me of causing the wreck this time. She told me that Harry was stable but had a broken femur. Taylor was being prepped for an ultrasound to check on the supposed baby. Deborah's voice was a low whisper that carried the weight of a death sentence. She knew I was the one who sent the email. We were two predators watching a dying fire. The waiting room felt like a sensory deprivation chamber. For the next hour, I watched a janitor mop the floors with a slow, rhythmic motion. The pressure mounted as Taylor's parents arrived, looking disheveled and frantic with worry. They didn't see me sitting in the corner shadows of the room. They went straight to Deborah, who ignored them with a cold, aristocratic silence. The social divide between the families was now a gaping canyon. I waited for the final medical blow. A doctor emerged from the double doors and signaled for Deborah and Taylor's parents. I stood up and moved closer to the edge of the hallway. The turn was absolute when the doctor spoke in a clear, professional tone. There was no pregnancy, nor had there ever been one, in Taylor's file. The lie was laid bare in front of both families at once. Taylor's mother let out a small, strangled cry of shame. Deborah simply nodded as if she already knew. The fallout was immediate and brutal in the quiet of the hospital. Deborah told Taylor's parents that they were no longer welcome in Harry's life. She promised to sue them for the damages to the car and the reputation. She was a woman who used litigation as a form of social cleansing. I saw Taylor's father slump against the wall, defeated by his own greed. They had gambled their dignity on a lie and lost everything. I felt a hollow sense of peace. I walked toward the exit as the security guards began to intervene. I didn't need to see Taylor's face to know she was broken. Her soulmate narrative had ended in a heap of twisted German metal. I stepped out into the cool night air and took a deep breath. The rain had slowed to a light mist over the pine trees. My life was finally my own again after weeks of war. The silence of the parking lot was my reward. I returned to my truck and found a single text message. It was from Taylor, likely sent right before the crash occurred on 97. She asked me why I couldn't just let her be happy. It was the final gasp of a woman who never understood accountability. I deleted the message and blocked the number for the last time. There were no words left to say to a ghost. I started the engine and turned on the heater. The warmth was real. I drove home and noticed a strange car in my driveway. It was a white sedan with a government seal on the door. A man in a suit was standing on my porch swing. He held a clipboard and looked toward me with a tired, official expression. My heart hammered as I realized the police weren't done with me. The complication was a local investigator looking into the crash. He wanted to know why I was the last person Harry called before the wreck. I stepped out of the truck and met the investigator's eyes. My objective was to provide the truth without incriminating myself in Harry's reckless choices. The investigator's presence was a heavy pressure that tightened the air around us. I handed him my phone and showed him the call log. Harry had called me to vent his misery, not to receive a threat. The man nodded slowly while checking the timestamps against the official crash report. The truth was my only shield now. The turn came when the investigator mentioned the dashcam footage from Harry's car. It recorded the entire conversation Harry had with Taylor before the impact. The audio was crystal clear, picking up the frantic desperation in Harry's voice as he realized his mother had cut him off financially. They weren't arguing about me or the folder anymore. They were screaming about the money Harry had stolen from his mother to fund Taylor's lifestyle. The power shifted as I realized I was just a ghost in their machine. They had been destroying each other long before I intervened. I felt a sudden, cold sense of relief. We stood on the porch while the rain turned to soft snow. The investigator asked why I hadn't reported the harassment earlier. I told him I preferred to handle my own wires. He didn't smile, but he closed his notebook with a sharp snap. He told me to stay in town until the final report was filed next week. I watched his car pull away, leaving me alone in the quiet. The weight of the last month finally began to lift. I went inside and started a fire in the hearth. The living room smelled of cedar and the fading scent of Taylor's expensive perfume. I realized the lie I lived was thinking I could control the storm. Stability was never a shield against a person who wanted to burn. I grabbed a trash bag and began clearing the last of her things. I found a hidden photo of us under the rug. I threw it into the growing flames without looking back. The next morning, Gus called me with a job near the vineyard. It was the same location where the wedding was supposed to happen. I hesitated for a second before grabbing my gear and my hard hat. I spent the day climbing poles and connecting lines under a clear sky. The view of the Cascades was breathtaking and indifferent to my pain. I felt the physical strain of the work grounding my soul. I was a lineman, and I had work to do. I finished the shift and sat on the tailgate of my truck. The vineyard was quiet, the vines dormant under a thin layer of winter frost. My phone buzzed with a final notification from the local bank. The deposit return had finally cleared into my account. I was officially free of the financial ties to a ghost. Then I saw a new white Subaru pull into the lot. Kylie was stepping out. But she wasn't alone. She was with a process server. I looked at the papers, realizing that while the ghost of our relationship was gone, the legal haunt was just beginning. Taylor was suing for emotional distress and a share of the home's equity. A final desperate grasp for the stability she had thrown away.